This is topic 9.4 and 9.5 for AP Environmental Science, Increases in Greenhouse Gases and Global Climate Change. Your learning targets or objectives are here at the top of each slide, so make sure you follow along on your study guide. All right, so you need to know what the IPCC is. Now, we just call it IPCC. You don't have to memorize that. It's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And basically, it meets every few years to discuss climate change and actions that need to be taken. So we learned in the last lesson about the Keeling curve and how atmospheric carbon dioxide changes have been increasing over the past decades. You need to know that developed nations like ours produce the largest amount of carbon emissions. Even though we're not the largest population on the planet, we produce the most. Now, as developing nations like China and India and others have begun to industrialize and people start to get their own cars and drive and burn fossil fuels and have electricity and all those things, they start to emit more carbon dioxide. China is showing the greatest amount of growth, and their emissions have grown the most because remember, they have 1.3 billion people. So by country, you can see that we have gigatons of carbon dioxide, and China is the largest. So that is actually new. On one of the previous slides, I said that United States does the most. Well, that has actually shifted. With this diagram, we can see that China, with all of its industrialization in the past 20 years, has now outpaced the United States in the most release of carbon. It used to be the US, now it is China. You can still see per capita, per person, the United States is second. Canada is slightly above us. That is new as well. We used to be the most per person as well. So we've gone down slightly. Remember, we have about 330 million people in the US. China has 1 billion and almost 400 million. So they have 1 billion more people than us. So per person, they produce about half of what we do in terms of carbon. But overall, because there's so many of them, they produce the most in their country. But again, strangely enough, Canada is now outpacing the US with carbon emissions. All right, so you can see here that we're using data from 1880 to 2020. So one thing to realize is that we did not really have accurate temperature equipment in the past. So even though we have records of temperature, they weren't particularly accurate until the past maybe 150 years. And so we have those temperature readings. The warmest years have occurred since 1998, which the top 7 warmest being the last 7 years. The average warming is low, about 1 degree Celsius to about 4 degrees Celsius, but this is the poles is higher. So this is the poles here, 1 to 4, which is about 1.4 Fahrenheit to 7.2 Fahrenheit. And that's significant because the poles really kind of drive a lot of the weather and climate for the rest of us. So over time, we have our data here, and of course it's hotter in the summer here if we're talking about northern hemisphere temperatures. But overall, you can see our hottest years overall have been the most recent years. So in different parts of the world, we have, of course, different temperatures in different regions, and you can see that this is the changes. So the most change up here in red is in our poles. So they're especially the North Pole, the Arctic region. And I watch shows sometimes set in Alaska, and they're struggling a lot when they rely on ice to, like, in the winter, they rely on solid ice to, go across the lake so that they can get supplies. And if that ice is unpredictable, it can be really dangerous for them. So they're actually people that live in Alaska, they are having trouble predicting for safety some of these weather changes. And then for us down here in the yellow, we've had a change of between 1 to 2 degrees Celsius warmer than in the past. That seems low, but it can cause a lot of changes. And so even though it seems like, well, 1 or 2 degrees is not that big a deal, we are seeing weather changes and climate changes that can cause a lot of economic damage. Okay, so we'll talk about that in a second. So how do we know that climate's changed over thousands of years? Because again, we only have like actual temperature readings for maybe 150 years due to the instruments that we have. So how do we know what the temperature was like? How do we know what the gases were like 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 10,000, 100,000 years ago? Well, one of the ways that we can tell is through ice cores. So ice cores are drilled into old ice in the Arctic and Antarctic, and they go back hundreds of thousands of years to tell us what gases were in the atmosphere in the past. So basically in the atmosphere, the gases are frozen. So we can carbon date how old the ice is, and we drill down really super deep, and then we can melt that ice and we can capture the gases. So we can figure out the levels of gases that were in the atmosphere at a certain point in time. Carbon dioxide and methane increased and decreased in a pattern in the past, but have never been high as current levels. So let's take a look at that. So they go up and down. This goes back 400,000 years. You can see here on the x-axis, and they go up and down. So we have natural climate change. That is true, called Milankovitch cycles. But look at our highest. Our highest CO2 is the highest it's ever been in the past 400,000 years. It's off the graph here. It also, we can see that as carbon dioxide and methane and other things go up, so does temperature. So they go together. So even though, yeah, it's like this happens in our past, in the past of the Earth's history, humans aren't really, we've only been around not that long compared to Earth's history, and so we're not necessarily adapted to super hot planet. But humans are pretty resilient. We'll figure out some ways to survive. Okay, so you can see on this one our historic CO2 concentrations. This is a little bit easier to see. The last graph had temperature, CO2, methane, and I think, actually let me go back. It had also, I think, nitrous oxide. It's hard to tell here on. So blue is carbon dioxide, red is temperature, green is methane, and brown down here, I can't read that. So it's another gas as well. Okay, here's just CO2. So in the past 400,000 years, it's never gotten really much higher than maybe 300 parts per million. We are currently here at 2022 above 400 parts per million. So we don't have really any, we're higher than we've ever been. And we think it's anthropogenic, human cost, burning of fossil fuels. Okay, so again, here's our historic methane. So this is CO2. This is methane, this is nitrous oxide, going back from 10,000 years to the present. Okay, so we can take this data, we can also look at tree ring data, we can look at sediment data. So it's not just ice cores, it's a whole bunch of data all over the world that we kind of piece together. The IPCC, when it meets, it looks at all of the data from all the scientists. So we can get predictions, but again, a lot of it's variable. So we're trying to make predictions of what could happen based on, computer models, theoretical models. So our predictions could be anywhere from 1.8 to 4 degrees Celsius, higher than it is currently by the year 2100. The range, due to whether or not CO2 emissions are rising in a slow, moderate, or high growth rate over time. Weather is spelled wrong here. It should be this weather, like that. Okay. So here are our predicted increases. So this would be low increases in CO2. So if we can, as a world, decrease our CO2 emissions or carbon capture it, or switch to alternative fuels, etc., then this would be the estimated increase in temperature by 2100. If there's a moderate amount of CO2 still being emitted, so we're still going up in CO2. We haven't reversed it at this point. And this would be a high increase, and we're talking about a lot of degrees Celsius change. Okay, so I talked about natural climate change, and we call those Milankovitch cycles, which are natural variations in Earth's climate due to the Earth's tilt and rotation around the sun. So we're actually in an ellipse around the sun, and that ellipse can change, which can change the amount of sunlight that reaches the Earth during different seasons. Same with the tilt. We're at a 23.5 degree tilt. Currently, we weren't always at that tilt, so that can change the amount of solar radiation. So we know there's natural variations. Why isn't the current warming not caused by Milankovitch? So our position of the Earth right now should be causing cooling, but it's not cooling, it's actually getting warmer. So we know that the natural cycles are being overridden by anthropogenic greenhouse gases. Okay, you also need to understand that aerosols and particulate matter can cause short-term cooling. So this is Mount Krakatoa in 1883. It was a volcanic eruption that blocked solar radiation for like a whole year, and there was famine in places like Europe. So Mount Krakatoa was in Indonesia, which is in Asia, all over the world. There was so much ash spewed into the atmosphere that it made everything colder. It blocked solar radiation for like a whole year, and crops didn't grow, and it caused hardship. So these things can cause short-term cooling, not long-term, short-term. Okay, so you need to know some effects of climate change and global warming. So we're expecting extreme weather events. I see that in California. We have more frequent fires, more devastating fires, higher winds that blow those fires. We have had a huge drought that we don't have right now, but we did a few years ago. More flooding, more snowstorms, more intense hurricanes. Precipitation patterns will change that, and so people aren't used to that. They may not have the infrastructure to deal with certain amounts of water or lack of water. Okay, so we also have some problems with polar ice caps that are melting and sea levels are rising. Now, the sea levels rising, which we're going to talk about in the next video, but the number one cause for sea level rise is that it's warmer, and warmer water takes up more space. So we call that thermal expansion of water. The second reason for sea level rising is melting of ice. We'll talk about that again in the next video. Okay, Arctic currently is warming at a higher rate, so they're at like 1 to 4 degrees Celsius, and is expected to rise another 4 degrees Celsius. So new ice cannot form during winter seasons, and more melts in the summer. The Antarctic is experiencing similar warming trends, leading to melting and loss of sea ice there as well. So these are our declines in ice mass since 2002, and so these are gigatons. So we've lost 2,500 gigatons of ice mass over the past 20 years. In Greenland, so this is Antarctica in the South Pole, Greenland's the North Pole, we've lost 5,000 gigatons of ice. All right, other effects of global climate change include glaciers have begun to melt on land and not refreezing in the winters. The exposed soil underneath those glaciers absorbs more heat, decreasing albedo, warming the planet even more. Due to increased fresh water from melting ice, the normal process of thermohaline circulation, so ocean circulation by densities, is going to be affected because ice is cold and it's fresh water, which is going to influence the densities. Parts of Europe could experience colder temperatures without ocean currents taking the heat from the equator to the poles, so it could mess up the Gulf Stream that takes warm water from the equator, shoots it across the Atlantic to northern Europe, which makes parts of northern Europe habitable and able to grow crops, like northern England, Scotland, Norway, Sweden. The melting of permafrost will lead to an increase in decay and release of trapped methane, creating a positive feedback loop. We're going to talk about those in just a second. Now, I went through these things fast. If you're jotting these down on your study guides, make sure you can pause the video to catch up. So sea levels have risen anywhere between 210 millimeters, which is about 8 inches, since 1900, and are expected to rise even more. Your coastal cities and low-lying nations will be more vulnerable to flooding, saltwater intrusion, and soil erosion. Shorelines will either need to be built up or people will be displaced. So you can see here, these are palm trees, and now they're in the ocean. So how it's going to mess up the photic zone is that you're going to have less photic zone because you're going to have deeper water in places, and so there's going to be more competition for that light. Remember, photic zone is the light ocean. The light zone in the ocean. That's back, I think, Unit 4 we discussed that. So where I live in California, even though I'm pretty close to the ocean, I'm at like 1,200 feet above sea level. And a lot of our coastal cities are up on cliffs above the ocean. And so we're not going to have as much property damage. Now, in places in California where it is pretty low, and there are, some homes and things that are low next to the beaches, they may be flooded, but a lot of our properties, just because of the topography, you get elevation pretty fast. But in other parts of the country, that's not the case. If you're talking Florida, it's pretty flat, and so sea level rise there is going to cause property damage. All right, let's talk about feedback loops. Again, you probably have studied this in other science classes. We studied feedback loops earlier this year in Unit 1 when we studied feedback loops like with food webs. So again, a reminder, positive feedback loop is a series of events or reactions that furthers the reaction. I should say events or reactions that furthers the reaction, which means it keeps it going. A negative feedback loop is a series of events or reactions that reverses the problem or reaction. Okay, so albedo is the amount of light or infrared heat that's reflected from a surface. Let's talk about the ice feedback loop, which is kind of the famous feedback loop, either in Greenland or in the Arctic or even Antarctic. So ice sheets are white and have high albedo. It reflects back a lot of solar radiation back from the Earth. When you release greenhouse gases, the Earth's temperature rises, ice melts, equals less ice, equals less albedo, which means the Earth heats up more quickly, which melts more ice, which then causes less albedo, which heats up the Earth more quickly, and so it's actually going to make the process go faster. Here's a couple more that you have to know. Well, first of all, you have to know specifically why there's a problem. The species particularly is polar bears that are going to be affected because they are adapted to hunt from ice. So either they will have some genetic variation that allow them to hunt and eat different foods, or they could go extinct in the wild. Okay, here's permafrost. So releasing greenhouse gases causes the Earth's temperature to increase, which melts permafrost soil. That's permanently frozen soils, now not permanently frozen anymore. These are like up north. The melting permafrost releases methane that's been trapped for thousands of years. Methane's a greenhouse gas that traps heat. The Earth gets hotter, then melts more permafrost, and goes on and on and on. Now, there's a negative feedback loop with forests. Burning fossil fuels releases carbon dioxide. More carbon dioxide in the atmosphere allows for more photosynthesis. Carbon is sequestered in the producer's biomass in the trunks of trees, which reduces the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So there's actually some negative feedback loops with climate change as well. All right, here's our rising sea levels. Here you can see this is in millimeters over time since 1900. Let's talk about some other impacts. So we're going to talk about there's excess heat. So animals can be influenced by and have like heat stroke, including humans and other animals. Some species are affected by extended, short, or shortened growing seasons and average temperature shifting. So in some places it might be warmer, which is good. Like if you're normally like in the tundra and you're a photosynthesizer, or let's say you're a plant or animal that likes warmer temperatures, it's going to be warmer. That might be nice for your particular species. But in other places, it might get too hot too fast and might be out of your range of tolerance to survive. You know, where I live in the summer, sometimes when it gets above 110, my plants out in my yard, my patio, they're very unhappy. And I have to put up shade structures to keep like my tomato plants from dying. So some of these places it's too hot to be growing effectively. So you've shortened your growing cycle. What else here? Breeding seasons can affect like sea turtles that have temperature dependent sex determination. So what that means is that sea turtles, whether you're a boy sea turtle or a girl sea turtle, depends on the temperature of the sand. And I don't remember which one's which, but we may end up with an imbalance of the sexes of sea turtles. More mosquitoes. So when you have warmer, now mosquitoes can get into control during the winter. When it's too cold, the mosquitoes all die out. Well, in some places, it might not get cold enough anymore to kill off the mosquitoes. And so their populations are just going to keep increasing. See, when the mosquitoes like die, so where I live, we don't have many mosquitoes, but we have some, and ants and things too. Well, the winter, they die off or they go in hiding. Well, like the ants go in hiding, but the mosquitoes die off. And it keeps their populations way down. Now, some eggs survive, and that's the ones that hatch, but you're going to start off in the spring with a small amount of mosquitoes. Well, if they never have that winter die off, you're just going to have increasing numbers of mosquitoes. And it's also going to be warmer in places that didn't have mosquito problems before. And so the mosquito areas are going to expand. We also now have a new mosquito species that can live in drier areas. That's why where I live in Southern California, we used to never really have mosquitoes in my town. Now we do because a new species moved in that doesn't need it as wet and humid. All right. You also have habitat fragmentation occurring as well. Excess heat may cause humans and animal species to migrate away. Human health can be affected. I think we just went over that on the last slide. Actually, this is a repeat here. I apologize for that. Let's just talk a little bit about mosquito-borne diseases. So some temperate biomes will turn tropical and not have an extended freeze in the winter to kill mosquitoes. This will increase mosquito-borne diseases such as malaria, West Nile virus, and Zika. All right, so I just talked about that, but that's the more formal explanation. And that is it for 9.4 and 9.5.